Yeah, this gets into some of the things that I read about the Belt and Road Initiative, about, China testing out AI surveillance technology in many countries, in certain African countries. Um, how worried are you about the consequences of those kinds of technologies in the context of the relationship between China and the rest of the world?
So, just from a human rights and democracy perspective, I'm extremely worried about the digital authoritarian system that China is promoting and is already supplying and operating in more than 80 countries as we speak. Because I just think about the data collection and messaging power of Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and then I just imagine that collected in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party and merged with the massive internal security apparatus that China already has going for it, and combined with China's many economic links with a lot of poor, either shaky democracies or already authoritarian regimes around the world. And when you combine all that, China is really able to push this particular model into other countries. And the reason China would do that, because a lot of people say, well, why would China want to export its political model? It's not really an evangelical power. But I think, autocracies want there to be more autocracies in the world because, one, other autocracies won't criticize them for their own human rights abuses. And second, if democracies look kind of shambolic or dysfunctional, that's also good because then their own people aren't going to want to emulate that system. And so these new technologies where it just makes authoritarianism so much more efficient than it ever used to be and so much more effective. It's just a lot cheaper. Instead of having to fund death squads, and send them around and beat people into submission, now dictators can sort of send subliminal messages through social media feeds and just mainline it into people's Facebook pages. They can use data to track entire regions within their countries. We're seeing that in Xinjiang today, where when you combine when you combine millions of video cameras and you're feeding the data, and then you use artificial intelligence to sort through all of those images very rapidly and identify potential perpetrators, and then you send in the normal security forces to go give a knock on the door. That's a very powerful system. And it also frees dictators from the traditional trade-off they used to face, where like you could either spend money on guns or you could spend it on butter. You could spend it on more security services to ensure your rule, or you could try to increase the amount of wealth that you're giving out to the population. But a lot of these technologies not only allow for authoritarianism, but they also enhance economic development. They help make the trains run on time. They help diagnose diseases. They help spur entrepreneurship. And so I just worry that dictatorship has just become much more efficient because of these technologies. China, as you mentioned, is sort of beta testing them in many countries around the world, and as well as within its own provinces, and is now starting to push those technologies, not because it wants to spread a particular China model, but because it does want to spread the amount of authoritarianism in the world and to try to destabilize democracies, try to make them more anti-democratic, try to, funnel in disinformation. Frankly, they're starting to use a lot of the tactics that Russia has perfected over the last 5 years. And so even though I'm not as concerned as some other folks you've mentioned about the sort of global balance of power, I worry about particular areas of competition with China. And this is one particular area that scares me the most, just because I think these new technologies give China such a much more powerful weapon than any past, Nazi Germany, the East Germans, the Soviets. They didn't have these kind of technologies at their disposal.
Right. And what the Nazis had and the Soviets had, that you argue China pretty much doesn't have, at least relative to America, is it any kind of truly threatening military? And it seems from your book you don't think they're likely to develop one.
I think the global balance of power is very much stacked against China. They don't have the bases, they don't have the aircraft carriers, the nuclear powered submarines to really project military power far beyond their borders. Now, that said, there are local balances of power, particularly in the Taiwan Strait, where if there was a war over Taiwan today, China would have home field advantage. They can hit targets all over Taiwan with never having to leave the Chinese mainland in the first place. They've got more than 1,000 missiles trained on Taiwan. They've built these new amphibious ships. So in a war over Taiwan where the U.S. has more than one arm tied behind its back, because the United States only has two major military bases within even 500 miles of Taiwan. They're on Okinawa, Japan. And China now has missiles that can potentially wipe those bases out in a Pearl Harbor style surprise attack. And if that happens, then the U.S. has to fight China from Guam, which is more than 1,000 miles away. And so you'd have to be sending in forces through a hail of Chinese missiles and mines to get anywhere close to the Taiwan Strait. And so even though I think the United States is much more militarily powerful than China in aggregate, in the places they're most likely to fight, and especially in the Taiwan Strait, the local balance of power is much closer than most people think, because geography sort of equalizes things for China. And they've been training their military specifically for that, while the United States has been, fighting wars in the Middle East that are, of course, very different than the kind of war that would take place with China in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea.